So now that we've looked at how to programmatically set and retrieve values from shared preferences, the next thing we want to look at is what if you want to provide a preferences screen to the user. And this is a screen where they can go and they can set up certain settings, and it provides a nice UI with checkboxes and radio buttons and things like that. Well, there's a great built-in mechanism in Android for doing that. And that's what I'm going to show you now. So I've created a blank project called Preferences Activity. And let's just go into our main layout file, and we're going to replace that text view with a button. And what's going to happen in this application is we're going to click on this button, and it's going to launch a new activity which allows the user to set their preferences. So let's go ahead and go to our Java code. And once again, let's set up our button using the trusty find view by ID. Make sure it's casted. And now let's set up the on click listener. Make sure we get that imported. And that's all we're going to do here for now. And once again, because this preferences screen is going to be another activity, we need to then create a new activity now. So I'm going to right click on my main package here and go to new class. And I'll just call this preferences. Now, unlike a regular activity, for this case, we're actually going to use preferences activity for the superclass. We'll click finish. Now, much like a regular activity, we're going to want to override the onCreate method. Now, in a regular activity, if we look here, what we do after we call the super method here is to actually use setContentView to set the UI for this activity from an XML layout file. We're going to do a similar thing in the preferences activity, but we need to create a new XML file. And we're not going to create a regular layout file. We're going to create a special preferences layout file. So let's click on the Create New Android XML file. And I'm just going to call it prefs for short, so prefs.xml. You can see we have an option to create a preference XML file. And we're going to leave the root element at preference screen and click finish. So inside of this XML file, we can provide a UI for the user to interact with. Now, we don't do this using the regular Android controls. So in this case, we're going to keep it pretty simple and just add a couple of checkboxes that the user can check off. Now, there's a lot of options available to you in a preference screen. You can group things together. There are all types of advanced things you can do. But in our case, we're just going to create a checkbox preference. And next we give it a key. And this is the key for how to reference this value from the shared preferences. And I'm just going to call it first because this is the first option here. Now, the next thing we're going to give it is a title. And this is the text that's actually going to be displayed in the preferences screen. So I'll just call it first option. Now, another thing we can do is to provide a summary property. And this is just some subtext that goes below the title. So let me just say this is the first option. And then I can close this. So I'm just going to do something simple. I'm going to copy and paste this one in and just change this from first to second. And say second option. So that's all I have to do in this XML file. Now, to load that into our preference activity, we don't use setContentView like we do in a regular activity. We actually use a method called add preferences from resource. Now, unlike a regular layout file, the preferences are not actually in the layout directory. They're actually in the XML directory. And there's my file. And we can see it saved here in the XML directory. So the preference activity is still an activity. So we need to actually go into our manifest file and define it. So I'm going to come under our main activity. And I'm going to give it a name. And that name has to be the class name. And again, we're just going to use the dot syntax, which is going to get us right to our main package here. And I called it preferences. And that's all I have to do to define it. So the last step in the process is I need to write the code that will actually launch that preference activity from my onClick. So to do that, I'm going to create a new intent, and it's already imported. I'm just going to call it intent. It's equal to new intent. And to this, we're going to pass in the context. Now again, since we're in an inner event handler, I'm just going to say main.this. This is the best way to get to the context. And then the class name of the preference activity. So here we have our preferences, and I'm going to say dot class. So now we have our intent set up. All we have to do is to say start activity, pass in our intent like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Now again, all we're doing here is when the user clicks the button, we're actually launching the preference activity. The user will be able to interact with that, and the values will automatically be saved. So here we are on the preference activity. If I click the button, we can see it's now launched the preferences activity. Now, one of the great things about this is we don't have to write any code to set these values. So as soon as we're in here, as soon as I check off a value, it's actually saving it to the shared preferences. So I don't have to write any specific code, and that's the benefit of using a preferences activity. So say I just leave this one checked. The next time I launch the application, even after we've exited, it will still remember these preferences. That's a really powerful thing, but we also need to know how to read those preferences, because it's great that we can set them and remember them, but we actually are going to want to use them in our application. So let me just show you a little code snippet about how you retrieve preferences here. So I'm going to create a new instance of the shared preferences class, and I'll just call it settings. Now, when you're dealing with a preference activity, it's saving everything into the default shared preferences for your application. We get a reference to that by actually calling a static method of the preference manager class. So preference manager, and then get default shared preferences. And here we just pass in the context, which we can just say this, because we're not in that inner event handler. So let's say that we wanted to retrieve this first option, which has a key of first. So we can determine whether it's checked off or not. So I'm going to create a Boolean value, and I'll just call it first. Now to retrieve something out of the shared preferences, all we have to say is settings, get Boolean, and now pass in the key. And remember, we defined the key as first. Here, for whatever reason, if there isn't a value, we can actually provide a default value. So let's say that I want to default it to false. And that's really all it takes to get information out of the shared preferences. And again, you're going to want to change get Boolean to a different method if you have a different type of data. The method you use is dependent on that data. So again, this is a really powerful way to give people options about how they want to interact with your application. And again, we didn't have to go through and create a list view with all these custom item renderers to set up a preferences screen. We can do this automatically by using the built-in preference XML layouts.